And now that we have the unit section of the molding PCR completed for Vivid Creations, we can move on to the cost section. So just like before, we're going to start our cost section by calculating in what amount of money was already committed to beginning WIP when the period started. And that was a total of $40,000 worth of costs, which were transferred in, $12,000 in material costs, and $6,000 of conversion costs. So just bring those numbers on down and copy them into your template, and then find the total of that. And we'll see that our units, which were in beginning WIP, already had $58,000 in costs committed to them before the period began. What got added? Well, the first department, the mixing department, transferred units to us, and when they did, they transferred the $149,000 worth of costs that went into mixing up those batches of crayons. And then the molding department added $18,675 in material costs and $21,850 of conversion costs. So we bring those numbers on down over here, and just like above, we determine that the sum of those three numbers, the amount of cost that got added to units during the period between both departments, was $189,525. So what do we have to account for? Just add what was already there to what was added during the period. And you get a total of $189,000 worth of transferred in costs that we have to account for, a total of $30,675 worth of material costs that we have to account for, a total of $27,850 in conversion costs we have to account for, and all in all, we got to figure out where $247,525 of production costs ended up. So let's figure out our cost per equivalent unit to make the math easier to do so. Take the cost added during the period by just copying down this row up above. That's $149,000 in transferred in costs, $18,675 in material costs, and $21,850 in conversion costs, and divide that by your equivalent units of production for those three cost categories, which we have up above was $4,000 for transferred in, $4,150 for materials, and $4,600 for conversion costs. And now, for my cost per equivalent unit, all I got to do is, just like before, divide our costs added during the period by how many units we could have produced start to finish for that amount of cost. $149,000 in conversion costs going into 4,000, or transferred in costs, going into 4,000 total equivalent units of production comes out to $37.25. I'm going to change this to the dollar formatting. There we go. $18,675 in materials was enough to make $41.50 for equivalent units, and that's $4.50 per batch of crayons. And $21,850 was enough to produce 4,600 equivalent units for conversion cost. That's $4.75 per batch. So now that we have what we have to account for and how much it costs us on average to make a unit from start to finish, we're going to figure out where those costs ended up. So for beginning WIP, one more time, let's start with the costs that were already in it when the period started. It's $40,000 of transferred in costs, $12,000 in material costs, and $6,000 in conversion costs, for a total of $58,000 worth of costs that were already in there before we started. For our costs that got added to beginning WIP, we take our beginning EUP, equivalent units, and we multiply that by our cost per equivalent unit of production. So our beginning WIP has equivalent units production of 0, times the $37.25 cost per equivalent unit is a big fat 0. For our materials portion of it, it took us enough costs to make 400 equivalent units to complete those units at beginning WIP, and each equivalent unit costs $4.50. So $1,800 was added for material costs to the units in beginning WIP to finish them. And then lastly, our equivalent units of production from beginning WIP is 1,000, and each equivalent unit cost $4.75. So in terms of conversion costs, $4,750 were added to those units in beginning WIP to finish them. Find the sum of all of those numbers, and it's $6,550. So $58,000 of the cost was already in there. and we added another $6,550 in the molding department. That is $64,550 that our beginning inventory cost us. I'm just going to change this to gray so we're not confused about this being an empty spot. There we go. For started and completed, you take your S and C equivalent units of production, started and completed equivalent units of production, and multiply it by your cost per equivalent unit of production. And there was 3,000 units that got started and completed during the period. Each one of those cost us $37.25 in cost, which were transferred in from the mixing department. So those 3,000 units that we started and completed during the period cost us $111,750 in transferred in costs. We had 3,000 equivalent units in terms of direct materials, and the cost per equivalent unit for direct materials is $450. So those 3,000 units that we made all the way cost us $13,500 in material cost to produce. And then lastly, we had 3,000 units that got started and completed. Each one of those would have cost us $4.75 in conversion cost, which means our total conversion cost is $14,250 for the 3,000 units that we started and completed. And if we sum all that up, those 3,000 units that got made all the way by the molding department during the period cost $139,500. So all in all, what got transferred out as a FIFO company is the $64,550 that was in beginning inventory, plus $139,500 for the units that we started and completed and transferred out. And that's a total of $204,050. I'll make this portion gray here too, because all we really need is the total. So for our ending WIP, we're going to take our ending, I can type our ending equivalent units of production, multiply it by our cost per equivalent unit of production. And for our ending WIP, the equivalent units of production for transferred in was 1,000. Multiply that by the $37.25 per equivalent unit, and those 1,000 units in ending WIP will have $37,250 of transferred in costs assigned to them. For the units that were in ending WIP, they were not quite complete for direct materials, and the amount of cost that we put into those 1,000 units to complete them 75% of the way would be enough to make 750 units from start to finish, and molding a unit from start to finish costs $4.50 in materials. So all in all, those units that are in our ending WIP should have $3,375 in material costs assigned to them. And then lastly, our equivalent units of production for conversion costs in our ending WIP is 600. Our cost per equivalent unit is $475, which means the 1,000 units in our ending WIP are assumed to have $2,850 in conversion costs tied up in them when the period ends. If we add those three together, the value of the molding department's ending WIP is $43,475. So what are our total costs that we accounted for? Well, I can just go now and find the sum of all of the numbers that are in the row. We accounted for $189,000 of transferred in costs. We accounted for $30,675 in material costs. We accounted for $27,850 of conversion costs. And our total cost accounted for is equal to the cost that we had to account for in here. We'll make it blue like we did before. There we go. And all our numbers match, so we know where all our costs are at. As far as our total cost for the period, we transferred out $204,050 worth of costs. Our ending WIP is containing $43,475 worth of costs when the period ends, and we've accounted for a total of $247,525. That also matches. So now we know that our PCR is good for the molding department. The molding department is going to transfer $204,050 out. And since they're the last department in the production process, that $204,050 is getting transferred out to finished goods inventory, while the other $43,475 is going to stay here as this department's value for ending WIP.